Thanks for giving up your lunch hour to come along to this. It's nice to be back. It's been about 9 years since I came back to the Met Office. I came back for the 20th anniversary of the Hadley Centre. There was a party and a cake, and that was nice to come back to. I left the Met Office in 2001, and I've been here since 1986 doing research in, developing the forecast model and the climate models. My specialism was clouds, really, and how to parameterize them. And I'm going to later on talk to some people who are still trying to figure out how to parameterize clouds. I'm be interested to see if there's anything left of what I did in the model, but probably not by this stage. This year, I'm a Baptist minister now. I'm based in a place called Croxley Green, which nobody has ever heard of. It's right on the edge of London, right next door to Watford. Croxley Station on the Met Line is where I live. But strangely, and it is rather strangely, this year I'm president of the Baptist Union, which sounds rather grand, but isn't. I don't have a big role within the Baptist Union. My main role is to go around the country visiting churches, talking about this theme of divine window, science and faith, and I work alongside our kind of secretariat actually to support them as well. And I've just been across to Lebanon for 10 days with our missionary society to see the work the churches are doing there. I'm sorry, I don't have time to talk about that. That would take another 45 minutes or so, or more. But I'm going to talk today about divine windows. I want to talk about science and faith, and how, for me, to talk about some of the ways I've been trying to bring those two things together, understand how they might speak to one another. So I need to say right at the beginning, I'm not out to prove God exists through science. I'm also not really into apologetics. I'm more interested in how, through science, you might encounter the Creator God, in kind of a spiritual way, and perhaps understand how some of the aspects of science that we know about actually connect with our understanding of the Christian God. Now, that's another caveat I need to ask. Now, this is not the first time science and faith has been talked about at the Met Office. I was here long ago in 1988. And in 1988, and when I joined the Met Office, Sir John Horton was the chief executive. And in 1988, he published this little book called Does God Play Dice? And although it says down here, look at the story of the universe, actually it was about the story of the universe, but it was how as a Christian he saw that and how that interacted with his faith. I don't have a copy of this book anymore. I gave it away to somebody a long time ago, probably somebody in the Met Office, and I haven't got it back. In fact, I've just bought a second-hand copy off Amazon, and it was supposed to come yesterday, and it hasn't. So this was John's take on science and faith. I guess, and we had a meeting at the Christian Fellowship where he spoke, and I remember being there. I guess, each of us, because of our journey, is different. We all perhaps have a different take on how these two areas connect together in my life. But I've been thinking about this for a while, and I came across this picture of what you might call a divine window, although it's not a window in a church. It's at Yale University. It's a series of stained glass windows called the Tiffany windows, because it's designed by the Tiffany strand of glassmaking. And there are 3 panels. There's a panel on music, there's a panel on art, and in the middle there's a panel on science and religion. And these windows are supposed to depict what makes a rounded education at Yale. Still a good theology department at Yale, doing some good work. But the more I look at this picture, the more I have questions about it. What does it say about the relationship between science and faith? You've got science on this side here. You've got religion on this side here. You've got these 2 figures, one looking down on the side of science to the nature, to the earth, the other in prayer and looking up to this figure in the centre, the light of life. This kind of Trinitarian hints in this picture. The more I look at it, I wonder if these 2 figures are the same. Is that old man the same as this old man? Is the young figure here the same as this young figure here? And over here, are these characteristics of science, devotion, labour, truth? And over here are these characteristics of religion, purity, faith, and hope? And yet some of this, actually, we would say we could attach to religion and faith two. I'm also interested that there's this kind of divide between the two. Science on one side looking down, faith on the other side looking up. Does that talk about this divide that we often hear about, at least in the popular media, between science and faith? If we'd had time, I would have asked you to unpack that a little bit more. It's fascinating when I do this with groups, asking them to interpret that picture about the relationship of science and faith. They see things I've not seen before. So I'm still learning about this picture. But I guess we don't have time to do that today. I think there isn't much science in the Bible. And the reason I say that is that what we know as science did not exist in the ages in which the Bible was written. The word science itself is a relatively new word, about 200, maybe 170 years old. It becomes quite popular in the literature in the early to mid-Victorian era to describe what previously had been called natural philosophy. But there are hints of science in the Bible. I had to go on what was then called the SO course, the Scientific Officer Training course. It's the first thing you did when you came into the Met Office to do a research role. And we were taught all about meteorology, and we were talking about forecasting as well as doing research. And I remember one of our tutors telling us about the different instruments to measure the atmosphere and to observe the atmosphere. And he was a former observer on an RAF base. And he insisted there was nothing better than the Mark I eyeball for looking at clouds. And they were acute observers, the people who wrote the Bible. This is a passage from the end of Job, those chapters in Job which use the imagery of creation to speak about the unfathomableness of God and his ways. This is what God says. God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? He draws up the drops of water which distill as rain to the streams. The clouds pour down their moisture and abundant showers fall on mankind. Who can understand how he spreads out the clouds, how he thunders from his pavilion? That is a remarkable description of what we would now call the water cycle. They didn't know much about science, but they were observers of the world around them, and they did understand something about how things happened in the world. I always read this passage with a little bit of a smile on my face, because, you lot, you might understand a little bit about how the clouds work, yeah? And I love this one, who has wisdom to count the clouds, because my doctoral thesis at Imperial College was on thunderstorms, and at one stage I was counting clouds. Well, there were simulated clouds, but I was trying to figure out the height distribution of the clouds, so I have to smile at that one as well. So they didn't know much about science, but they did observe nature, and that says to me maybe there is a link between what we now understand as science, the way we observe and understand nature there, and our understanding of God. So that gives me hope that we can make some progress in talking about this. I just want to reflect on the relationship of science and faith using three different kind of ideas. One is play. The second is order and the emergence of order. And the third is wonder. So let me talk about science as play. I work with an organisation called Messy Church. Do you know about Messy Church? In Messy Church, I am known as Dr. Dave. I run a project in Messy Church called Messy Church Does Science. This is the book we published about a year ago. 100 science experiments for messy churches to use, hands-on, using kitchen equipment, to explore both the wonder of creation and also actually to explore an encounter with God through prayer or through illustrating a Bible story. When I got involved in this project, after a while, they said, Dave, do you think we can make a little cartoon of you? So this is what they made. You can decide if it's more photogenic than me. But in our Messy Church, we run that on a Wednesday afternoon, and I run a science lab there. We have a couple of tables like this. We normally have about 15 families coming along. Each child normally gets a set of equipment, and we just play with science. Because some of the kids who come to my messy church. They don't like football. They probably weren't watching England last night. But they do like science. And they're really into science and nature. So we're connecting with those kids and their families. What I find is actually it's the parents who after a while they come along and they say, Dave, isn't it a bit strange? I say, what? And they say, isn't it a bit strange that you're a Christian, you're a minister, but you're doing science in church? How do they fit together? That's the kind of perception they're getting from outside. And I guess working with under 11s, families with under 11 children, we're trying to counter that narrative in them. But this is one of the experiments I do. I do cloud in a jar. Actually, this is my wife's best vase and a salt shaker. Well, what it is boiling water with food colouring in, and you lower it very carefully into the bottom of the jar, and lo and behold, you get this funnel of warm water coming up like a cloud. I do a control, by the way. I lower in a salt cellar with just cold water in, with red food dye in it, and actually nothing happens. Apart from a little bit of diffusion, nothing happens. So this is a great experiment. I do this in school as well. So that's the kind of experiment that we do. But there is something about science which is about play. People think science is all about facts and figures and numbers and equations and things like that. To me, science is just as creative as art and music and drama and literature. It's an aspect of human creativity that God has given to us. And when we're doing research and when we're observing nature, to me there is a sense of play with ideas and understanding what the world is like. And actually the world is full of play. I don't normally watch David Attenborough's programmes, but I did get taken in by Blue Planet 2. And actually this programme has probably done more for the environment and people's awareness of the issues around climate change and damage to the environment than actually, to be honest, IPC reports have had in the last 20 years. So this is some of the play that you see in creation. These ridiculous animals. Yeah, this one's ridiculous. I mean, actually, it's even more ridiculous, this animal, this fish, because if I remember rightly, if there's a shortage of males, when one of the females grows to a certain size, it goes away for about 3 or 4 months into a hole in a rock, and it comes out a male. There's a transition in gender in this species. That's crazy. I mean, that's just crazy. And this, even down the smallest scales, there's a beauty there. But, this is the variety that we see in creation. A theologian called Maltman, who's done a lot of thinking, serious thinking about science and faith. He's a good author to read, along with another one called Pannenberg. He produced in the 70s a very thin book called The Theology of Play. And he makes this, he says this in that book, why does God create? And he says that's a very childlike question. And his answer to it is that creation is God's play, a play of his groundless and inscrutable wisdom. The variety that we see in creation is a sign of God playing. And actually, when we do science, we're exploring the playfulness of God with the playfulness that he has given to us. So maybe in play, in childlike play, there is a connection between our understanding of God and science. What about order? I mean, science is a search for order. I was in Beirut and at this conference about Islam and the religious other, and they asked me to talk about science, because they thought that was a religious other in a sense. How do you connect with science? And I was talking to a lady who'd actually done some research on the early chapters of Genesis and the stories there in the Bible and how they connected with Islam. And we were talking about the story where God gets Adam to name all the animals. And for me and for her, that's something that we do in science. It's an ordering of the world that we are involved in through our science. Her comment to me, interestingly, in the Quran, there's the same story. But man doesn't name the animals. God does. God names the animals. So there's something in our Christian story which says we are searching for order, and God gives us a capacity to bring something of an orderly view of the world. I guess one thing that has struck me, and one thing we've discovered, especially in the area of meteorology over the last 50 years, is the idea of chaos. And that order emerges out of disorder. Order emerges out of a mess. And that seems to be true over a wide range of scales, from very small scales to very big scales. So snowflakes, they don't always look pristine like this, but there is a beautiful order about them. And that doesn't come about because somebody's been piecing them together like Lego bricks. That just comes about through the collision of water molecules, the collision of water molecules with ice. Somehow in the structure of water, that structure emerges. In those almost seemingly random interactions, order emerges. You can just look at a satellite picture. Yeah, you can get random patterns of clouds almost, but we know that they produce structures as well, like hurricanes. And not only the swirling structures, just look at the striations in the cirrus that are pouring out. It's not just a continual band of cloud, there's fine detail in this. Order emerges out of seemingly random processes. And you see it even in the biggest scales of the universe. In stars, when they clump together under gravity, form these beautiful structures, this order emerging out of disorder. Oh, by the way, that's one of your probability rainfall charts from 2017. That's the only one I could download off your website the other day. We understand in meteorology that even in a mess, order can emerge. And I think there's a resonance there with our story of faith in the Bible, because in the Bible, God makes the world a mess. Let there be light is not the moment of creation in the Genesis story. Right at the beginning, it said God made the heavens and the earth was a raging ocean, literally a wasteland, a desert, without any form or order, and the Spirit of God is hovering over it. And then God says, let there be dry land. In the Hebrew world, because of they were a land people, not a sea people, the sea for them was a symbol of all that was against God, all that was disordered in the world. Land for them was order. And at that start of the Genesis story, we have a God who makes in a mess and yet draws out order from the mess to bring structure to the world. And at Easter too, we might see that in terms of disorder and order. That Christ steps into the disorderness of our world and God acts to bring out the order of resurrection in our lives. Maybe the order and disorder, the emergence of order we see in our science is just a mark of God's continual sustaining activity in creation, which we can view through the lens of these moments of revelation. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan, and the Franciscans had had a long history of engaging with spirituality, with creation, and now with science. In fact, I'm finding, if you want to talk about science and faith, read Roman Catholic authors. They have a much stronger tradition of engaging with science than the Protestants. There is a Vatican observatory on the edge of Rome, at the top of a hill, which surrounds an old flooded volcanic crater. They have a long history. I was at a conference last year in Oxford, met a Catholic priest from India who had a doctorate in quantum physics. That's what he was encouraged to do as a Jesuit, and was engaged actually in research as well as leading church. But Richard Rohr's a Franciscan, and he suggests, drawing on actually a theologian from the 13th century, he says, Bonaventura, the Christ mystery is a template for all creation, revealing the necessary cycle of loss and renewal, disorder and order, shaped by God's action and being. And then the third thing is wonder. Now, I think wonder is wonder at creation is a human characteristic which is universal. It's not just Christian, it's not just linked to religious people, it's something that everyone of faith and no faith experiences. I because I live near London, it's easy to get into the museums, and my wife and I love to go to the British Museum to see all the ancient artefacts there. And last year they had an exhibition called Living with the Gods. It was an exploration of expressions of human religious thought from 40,000 years ago to the present day. And I got really interested in science when I was quite young, 8, 9, because of the American moon missions and the Soviet space missions in the 60s. So I was really interested in this exhibition. They had this poster. This is a poster that the Soviet Union produced after Yuri Gagarin became the first human beings to get into orbit and come back safely, just about. And this is Yuri Gagarin in space. He never walked in space, actually. That was a few years later. But this says here in Russian, "There is no God." Now, it's reported that Yuri Gagarin said this. It's not clear, if you read it up on it, whether he said it from orbit, "There is no God," or whether it was in response to a question from Chairman Khrushchev at a press conference or a reception when he got back down to Earth. But this was the Soviet propaganda at the time. There is no God. I didn't see God up there. There's an interesting contrast with another iconic picture of those 60s early space trips. This is a picture taken from Apollo 10. Apollo 8. Apollo 8 were the first 3 people of Apollo 8 to orbit the moon and come back to the Earth. The first people to see what's called Earthrise as the Earth comes up over the lunar horizon. And on Christmas Eve, 1968, as those 3 astronauts, Borman, Irvin, and I forget the third one, as they saw this, as they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve, they took it in turns to read from Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's just a fascinating contrast. Both encounter the wonder of creation in a way that nobody's ever seen before. And yet for one, there is no God. For the other, that wonder is linked to words of faith and words about the Creator. I don't think wonder takes us to faith. It can actually go both ways. In the 1970s, there was a scientist called Carl Sagan who produced a series called Cosmos. He was the Brian Cox of his generation. And he was also an atheist. And at the end of Cosmos, he looks to camera and he says these words: "For small creatures such as we are, the vastness is only bearable through love." I think he's talking about human love and human relationships. Because in the face of the vastness, the wonder of creation, you can feel very small. And maybe through human relationships, you understand that you're special. I don't think it's far from the kingdom of God, though, there. You see, my journey towards faith, science took me away from faith in my teenage years. I stopped going to church. I gave up on God. But it was when I was at university doing physics that I started to rethink that through. And one day, on the way to lectures in my second year, just walking down an ordinary road, pondering these things, that's what I thought. In the face of the vastness and the wonder of it all, that's what I thought. Maybe there is a God. But what's that got to do with me? I think as Christians we have an understanding of love. And I think Carl Sagan was right. The vastness of it all is only bearable through love. But we have an understanding of a God who loved the world. Actually, the Greek word is cosmos. Cosmos, the vastness of it all. Who loved it so much that he gave his only son. The vastness is only bearable through love. I think our faith has something to say to that, and to say to all those who experience wonder.